On today's show, I'll be joined by Flip Livingstone of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast to talk all things fantasy hockey and how it pertains to the Dallas Stars. Which Stars players should you draft? When should you draft them? We'll talk some NHL bets and odds as far as conference and division winners, and talk about why you should be doing fantasy hockey if you were on the fence or hesitant to do so. All coming up on a great Wednesday episode of Locked On Stars.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily in-season podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Dallas Stars Media, coming to you on this Wednesday, August 31st. Whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener of the show, thank you for stopping by today's episode and for making Locked On Stars your first listen every single day. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. Help us get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of 2022. You can also find and follow us on your favorite podcasting platform and leave us a 5-star rating or review if you enjoy the show and like what you hear. You can find and follow me on social media at Dane_Lewis. At Locked On Stars is the show handle on Twitter. But without any further hesitation, let's get into today's episode. In the chat I got to have with Flip Livingstone of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. All right, everybody, joining me now on today's episode, a very special guest, Flip Livingstone from the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. And Flip, we're still kind of in the throes of the offseason and still, waiting for preseason and training camp to get started, but we are so close with September just right around the corner. And at the end of the month, a lot of teams will be reporting for camp and getting their preseason games rolling. How are you hanging in this last final stretch of the offseason?
Yeah, well, a lot of what we do on our show is a lot of betting, projections and whatnot. So let's just say I've been wasting some of my NHL money on some golf bets and some NFL futures. So this is the time of season that us fantasy drafters get pretty fired up for hockey. But I'm also, as a bettor, very, very excited to get the action back started on the ice. So reporting to camp is a very good sign for us bettors out there on the NHL market.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like a lot of exciting things to bet this season. I know a lot of odds have already started to come out as far as conference winners, teams that can make the Stanley Cup, and even as far as individual awards, whether it's the Vezina, the Hart, the Norris, you name it. A lot of big names, of course, that you would expect to see, but you never can fully expect the awards to be won by the guys you expect preseason. There's always someone for at least one award that comes out of nowhere to at least be a finalist and sometimes end up winning the award. But we might get to talk about a little bit, some bets here down the road on today's episode, but really want to pick your brain on some fantasy talk, especially as it pertains to the Dallas Stars, as I know many of the people listening to this show, whether they've done fantasy hockey or not, I feel like fantasy sports continue to increase in popularity. I know football is king here, especially in North America, but sports like basketball, baseball, and especially hockey really starting to gain some traction in the fantasy world. And before we dive into Dallas Stars specifics, just kind of want to open the floor to you a little bit about what fantasy hockey looks like as far as drafting and what the best strategies might be going into preseason and training camp, the best way to go about, building a team early on before the season gets going.
Yeah, for sure. Really, for any fantasy head, either new or old, when it comes to drafting, when it comes to this time of the year in preparation for the NHL season, it really comes down to the format of your league. It comes down to what is the categories, what is the actual format? Is it head-to-head? Is it rotisserie? Is it season long? Maybe there's a dynasty. When it comes to fantasy, there are a lot of different options in terms of how your league can be set up. So really, the first thing I always let people know is definitely know the league you're getting into, know the rules, know the statistics, know how your points are being racked up, because there's nothing worse than entering into a league that might be more goaltending category heavy and you went ahead and drafted your goaltenders too late. You're behind the 8 ball in your league from the very jump. But it's preparation as well, Dane. You got to do your research. You got to be tuned into shows like Locked On Stars, Locked On Fantasy Hockey, you got to be doing your research because especially if, up here in Canada, fantasy hockey, there's some high stakes on the line. If you're invested into some of these leagues, you got to be doing your research because I'll tell you, there's going to be someone out there in your league who's out there picking good young players, maybe the Jason Robertsons, Roope Hintzes of the world, even last year before other people knew about it. So I would say it really comes down to how these leagues are set up and all in your preparation. That is for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the big name Dallas Stars players, Roope Hintz and Jason Robertson, still at the time of recording this unsigned, but maybe if I keep saying that enough, eventually he'll get signed and I'll look dumb on a recording, which would be a good problem to have because it means Jason Robertson is officially still a part of this team going into this season. But the Stars, it's really no secret to people who follow this league and especially follow this team that sometimes goal scoring is difficult to come by for this team. So as far as Dallas Stars players, what kind of players do you think you go after? Because obviously you have the Hintzes, the Pavelskis, the Robertsons, but then after that, it's kind of a mixed bag as far as what you get. So just, from your expertise, from your experience, what's the best way to go about drafting specifically from the Dallas Stars?
Look, the book is out on the Dallas Stars, right? Perennially been a team that's in the top 10 in goals against. They play stingy defense. I know last year I think they finished just outside of the top 10, I think 12th in goals against. So they're still, a stingy defensive team. But we know that they also perennially finish in the bottom of the league in goals scored. And aside from that top line with Jason Robertson, Roope Hintz, and Joe Pavelski, and, they really did form some nice chemistry last year. And look at Joe Pavelski, at his age, benefiting with an 80-point season playing along two young studs. These are where you can find the value in fantasy. On the power play, peripheral points with some very good young players and Jason Robertson and Roope Hintz. That's clear with the Dallas Stars. But I do think that there are some valuable pieces elsewhere. You guys acquired, I say you guys like it's your team, Dane, but I mean the Dallas Stars acquired Mason Marchman in the offseason, a budding sniper, but had a really good year on a good offensive team. Can he still pick up that steam playing alongside the likes of Radek Faksa, Luke Glendening, and others? That might be a taller task. He's still a valuable piece. And I'm going to look at the two veterans making 9.5 plus million to have a bounce back season, Dane. If the Dallas Stars want to have any shot of making the playoffs next season, those two players need to be a lot better. And in my opinion, they still hold a lot of fantasy value. And I do think that they're going to be better this year. I really do think so. 33 years old and 30 years old for Tyler Sagan. I think Jamie Benn's 33. They should have lots of left in the tank. I know injuries have been a concern, but I think Jamie Benn and Tyler Sagan are going to have bounce back years, and I'd be looking at both of them. Later rounds of your draft for sure, but I do think you can still find some value down the lineup in Dallas with the players I mentioned.
Yeah, for sure. I think especially with a guy like Sagan, I think there's still plenty of offensive upside there. I think there's a good chance that he plays alongside Marchment, who came over in the offseason. I think they could be, on that second line together with maybe Sagan playing that center spot. We're just going to have to see how the new coaching staff kind of sets things up. And, kind of going off of that new coaching staff, you mentioned the potential bounce back seasons for these veterans. And I think a lot of the reason for that optimism for you, myself, and other people who are just hoping to see this team take steps forward offensively, you have Peter DeBoer come in as head coach and maybe putting you on the spot here a little bit just with, I didn't send you this question before, but it just came to my mind. What was the performance like of players that have been coached by Peter DeBoer over the past few seasons, mainly in Vegas, but even maybe as far back as San Jose? I mean, you look at, Peter DeBoer-led teams. Were there any really standout guys or any, particular teams that had good players or good units that, people should say, oh, now Peter DeBoer is coaching the Stars? Maybe we, that adds a little bit of stock to the offense or the players on the roster.
It's a great question. And, the last couple of years in Vegas, with the Knights, he did have some good blue lines to work with. And I really do think the strength of the Stars comes from the back end. And I know Scott Wedgwood is signed and Jake Oettinger currently is still unsigned. I think Jake Ottinger's deal is going to get done. I think Jason Robertson's deal is going to get done. Everything I read and everything I hear indicate that, yes, they're still do not have deals done, but both camps indicate that they're going to get it done. So the strength for me, for Pete DeBoer, comes from that back end. He's proven that he can coach some good defensive-minded teams. I really like what this could mean for a guy like Miro Heiskanen. He is clearly the leader on that blue line. I would be looking at him right after Hintz and Robertson as your fantasy targets. And I think when it comes to coaching, I think you might see a side of his game come out this year under DeBoer. Rick Bowness, in my opinion, is also a good coach. So I really do think it comes down to the players on the ice this season. I think in Dallas, you have a beauty in Jake Oettinger. Not to get ahead of ourselves if you were going to talk about it, but to me, that's where the strength comes, because Scott Wedgwood's also proven that he can be a serviceable backup and step into 20 to 30 to 35 games should a number one go down. So to answer your question about DeBoer, I would say look for an improvement on some of those guys on the back end. And one of those sneaky guys I'd be looking at is Thomas Harley to potentially jump up and have an impact this year. And Pete DeBoer could be the coach to bring that out of him.
Yeah, that seems to be the thought of a lot of people. I've had a few Stars beat writers on the show that think that as well. Harley, the first round pick for the Stars back in 2019, to finally take this step to be a full-time NHL player, likely getting top 4 minutes top 4 minutes on the defensive side if things go well. Maybe not playing directly alongside Heiskanen, but being that next guy up on that second pairing for the Stars decor. And you mentioned Heiskanen, and you say you maybe take him after Robertson. Hence, where do you expect him to go as far as rounds in a fantasy draft? Alongside the likes of your Cale Makars, Adam Foxes, the other elite defensemen in this league, Roman Josi. I mean, where do you expect Heiskanen to stack up compared to those guys?
Those are some very big shoes to fill when it comes to the fantasy side of things. And as much as I really do like Heiskanen's overall game, and he's so young and still getting better, we haven't seen the best out of him yet. I think it might be a tall ask to expect the kind of fantasy output when you're comparing him to the players that you just mentioned in the Makars and the Roman Josis of the world. But when it comes to drafting him again, this is when you have to really look at the format of your league. Because if it's a dynasty league, as in one where you're re-keeping some of the same players over and over again year after year, you have a core piece of group of players that you keep. Heiskanen is a guy that moves higher up in the drafts because of his age and because of his overall quality. But I'm going to say, he's a later top 10 round draft pick for me. 36 points last season. I think you'll see closer to 50 points from him this season. But Cale Makar, Adam Fox, Roman Josi, these are 70, 80 plus point, some 90 plus point guys in potential. So I'm going to say he's not quite there yet, but he is budding on that second tier of good young defensemen. I think he can step up his offense, but losing Klingberg is going to hurt there.
Yeah, 100%. Klingberg, definitely a guy that's difficult to replace, and one of the bigger names on the defensive market this offseason, and really felt inevitable that he was going to leave, and now he's off to Anaheim, where I think that he'll fit in nicely with that young core that they have establishing there in Anaheim of Zegras and company there. Maybe not quite ready to take that next step, Anaheim is, but I think Klingberg will be a nice addition to that team for sure. And we're going to continue to talk about some Stars fantasy stuff and talk about some odds and bets later on in the show as well. But speaking of bets, do want to take a moment and say thank you to one of the sponsors of today's episode, and that is, of course, BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your betting needs. You can find your favorite sports and events at the #1 online source for odds, lines, and games. You can find reviews and news of every league, including Major League Baseball. Got MLB postseason coming up. The NFL season is just around the corner, and NBA and NHL will be here right before you know it. BetOnline.net continues to be the top online resource for all your sports wagering information. From live in-game betting, scores, podcasts, they have you covered on everything you could need to know in the sports world. You can head to BetOnline today or use your mobile device to learn more about the action happening. BetOnline.net is where the game starts. All right, Flip, continuing to talk about fantasy hockey as it pertains to the Dallas Stars. We've talked about the offensive players, talked a little bit about Miro Heiskanen and Thomas Harley, the defense, and you touched on the goalie tandem a little bit with Ottinger and Wedgwood. Again, we are also hoping, along with Jason Robertson, that Jake Oettinger does get a deal done soon, which I still am in the boat that both those guys will get their deals signed. But when you go to look for drafting a goalie, and I know, again, it depends on what kind of league you're in, but if you're, maybe this is your first year doing fantasy hockey and you're just going for a very generic league, when do you look to take a goalie, and, how important is it to not only have one good goalie, but, two? Every NHL team, as far as real hockey goes, looks to have two solid goalies. One's going to obviously be a little bit better than the other, but how important is it to have, at least two very solid goalies on your fantasy team? Because you can put up the really good, numbers with the skaters, but the goalie is also very important.
It's a really, really good question, Dane. And honestly, it's something that I preach on our show regularly, is how important goaltending can be. And again, if it's a league that is split in terms of skater and goaltending categories, which they often can be, you really do need to be paying attention to your goaltending roster, because it can be very difficult in the middle of the season to try and pick a guy up. And when it comes to drafting the goaltending position, again, do your research. Make sure that, yes, the starting 30, the around 30 guys in the league. But this year, more than ever, there are a lot of 50-50 splits across the league, even with some great teams like, for example, with the Colorado Avalanche. Both Alexander Georgiev and Pavel Francouz are going to be legitimate options because of how good the team that they play on is. Jake Oettinger, even a guy like Scott Wedgwood in deeper leagues, he could be worth a look, but I really do think Jake Oettinger is going to play a lot of games this year. I do think it's going to be for the Dallas Stars. I don't see him change. I don't see there being any kind of issue with him starting the season. They're going to get this deal done. But to answer your question, I'm looking at taking goalies now. If it's Igor Shesterkin, Ilya Sorokin, and Andrei Vasilevsky, those are your top three. No matter what format your league is, if you're listening out there, those are the three guys, all Russian goaltenders, that you want on your team. After that, and you're going to be taking those guys in the top two rounds for sure. After that, you can wait a little bit, because there are a lot of guys in that second tier, Jake Oettinger being in that second tier, no doubt. 30, 15, and 0 last year, impressive season. And I'm excited to see what he does with a full season as the number one. There's no one to bother him this year. It is his cage. I hope that answers your question. But the goaltending position when it comes to fantasy is critical. And if you're not getting those top three guys that I said, I think you can wait a bit. 6th, 7th round, there are a lot of good secondary options out there across the league.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just harping on that, do your research part. You can get a guy that maybe isn't a big name or a really attractive name, but if they have, really good blue line and play really good defense, that could still be a guy, worth looking into. I think that embodies the Dallas Stars pretty well. Ottinger, obviously a pretty qualified goalie and had a really nice outing last season. Really good stretch in the postseason, but also the Stars known for playing that hard-nosed style of hockey and, really solid defense. So again, it just kind of, like you said, comes down to the league you're in and how deep your league goes, to be on the lookout for that. And of course, they can listen to you and Steele as well to get updates on who to go after as far as, waiver wire pickups, draft pickups, things like that.
Definitely. That's what we're here to do. And hey, if you are new to fantasy, take a look at your Dallas Stars. This is what you're listening to Dane for. But again, there are a lot of great Locked On podcasts out there across covering the entire NHL. Lots of great content, especially on the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast. So there's the plug for that, Dane.
Yeah, absolutely. Love the cross plugging, and I know we'll probably be working together down the line. And before I let you go, just want to pick your brain a little bit the last few minutes that we do have about some odds and potential bets. I know you guys, like you said at the start, you guys talk a lot about bets and things of that nature, and not necessarily my area of expertise, but I know you and Steele for sure. And you look at, I don't have them pulled up now, but I'm sure you're maybe a little more familiar than me. Some of the odds as far as the Western Conference goes. Who do you like winning each division, and who do you like winning the conference this year?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and we talk a lot about odds, futures bets, BetOnline. Shout out to them, a great resource as well. It's a very great question that you asked, Dane, and it's a tough one because the easy answer is the Colorado Avalanche deserve that Central Division and the Western Conference. That's almost the cop-out answer, but I don't know what losing Nazem Kadri will do to the makeup of that top six. Darcy Kemper, to me, isn't as much as of a replacement. I think Francouz and Georgiev can hold it down. But there's something about what's going on in that top six, and this is maybe a bold take because of how good Rantanen, Landeskog, Cale Makar, Nathan McKinnon are, and others. But I'm looking at a team in the Edmonton Oilers who have the two best players in the conference in Leon Draisaitl and Connor McDavid to make some noise next season. The Calgary Flames salvaged their offseason and became a much better team as well. So those two Western Canadian teams are going to be going toe-to-toe all season long. And I really could see the champion of the Western Conference coming out of Alberta and Western Canada next year, if it's not the Colorado Avalanche. And maybe that's a cop-out as well. But to me, the Pacific is Edmonton or Calgary's to lose. Central, that's going to be Colorado. And in the East just got absolutely deadly. And I'm looking at some teams with some odds. The Tampa Bay Lightning are going to be right back in there. Great odds for the Stanley Cup. And honestly, the New York Rangers are great as well. So there's a lot of good value you can get in there. But realistically, when it comes to the West and the East, we are so early in the season that you're going to find a lot of value on some bets in a lot of places. So $10, $15, a couple of places across this board, you can definitely find some value. But I really do think the Eastern Conference got a lot better this offseason.
Yeah, I do too. I do not envy any of those teams in the Eastern Conference because I think it's just going to be an absolute gauntlet, especially that Atlantic division. You mentioned Tampa Bay, but Toronto's still going to be good. They have arguably the best goal scorer in the league in Austin Matthews. The Florida Panthers, I think, still going to be a great team despite, losing Huberdeau. They get Matthew Tkachuk, who's, just as great of an offensive player, if you ask me. So you have those teams as well as the rest of that division. Detroit, Ottawa taking strides to get better. And then
Ottawa
even the Metro,
has been a much improved team. If you're listening out there, keep your eye on the Ottawa Senators from a fantasy and betting standpoint as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That team has been making so many moves this offseason that, if I had to pick an Eastern Conference team to kind of pull for this season, it might be the Ottawa Senators, even though they gave the Stars fits last season early on. I think they played their games like 2 weeks apart, first month of the season, and Dallas loses both of them. And so now I can't even imagine what that matchup's going to look like now that they're a much better team and, have a lot more solid of a roster. I think that they could, potentially be a wild card threat this season, and the Metro as well. I mean, you have New York, both New York teams. I think the Islanders are maybe a little bit of a slept-on team. They had a rough go of it last year. Despite the lack of moves this offseason, I still think they have a really solid roster. And then they add arguably one of the best players from last season in Johnny Cadreau to the Columbus Blue Jackets, a team that wasn't terrible, was kind of, flirting with a wild card spot early in the season and then just, fell off. And the other teams in the Metro really just took off and claimed those wild card spots, whether it was the Penguins, the Rangers, really, really solid stuff out east. And then, of course, out west. I very much agree with those three teams in Colorado, Edmonton, and Calgary. I think they'll be great. I think the LA Kings are due for a good season, and I think could finish third in that Pacific division. And then the Central, just going to be as chaotic as ever, I feel like, throughout the maybe 2 to 5, 6 range. Nashville, Minnesota, St. Louis, Dallas, I think will all be competitive. Winnipeg, also going to be very interesting with former Stars head coach Rick Bowness at the helm there. Do you think anyone else in the Central even comes close to competing for that title, or you think it's Colorado far and away?
Great question. Honestly, I do think it's going to be a lot like, Minnesota only finished 6 points back of Colorado last year. I do think it's going to be a lot tighter of a spread, mostly due to the fact that I think the Nashville Predators are going to be a better team. A couple of sneaky moves, adding Nito Niederreiter and Ryan McDonough in the offseason. David Poyle is one of those GMs that I constantly take my cap off to. They have a very good and underrated goalie in UC Saros, one of the best D-men out there in Roman Josi, and arguably one of the best fantasy lines in the offensive realm with Matt Duchene, Ryan Johansson, and Philip Forsberg. So I would say another future bet, take a look at the Nashville Predators because that odd is juicy. And I would say Colorado, Minnesota, St. Louis, Dallas, and Nashville, those are clear and far and away, in my opinion, the 5 that have a shot at this division. I'm not talking about a shot at winning it. I mean at being a playoff team because Winnipeg, Chicago, and Arizona, yes, I know Winnipeg has Hellebuck, Kyle Connor, and other pieces, but this division is the top 5 teams that finished last year. It will be those top 5 teams once again.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the Pacific kind of falls into a same category of some good young pieces, some good teams with some nice young talent, but maybe not enough to make the postseason. So we could be seeing a pretty similar spread of postseason teams out of the Western Conference, just maybe a little bit of a shuffle as far as the seeding. And one last question for you before you go, kind of shifting back to fantasy for the people listening that might be on the fence. They've never done fantasy before. They're maybe hesitant to join a league or look into, participating in fantasy hockey, what is your advice to that listener?
Start small. Start simple. Don't join into a league with too many teams, and don't do it for any money. A lot of fantasy leagues come along with an entry fee or some sort of stakes. Well, Yahoo, ESPN, tons of sites out there. You can join for free. You don't have to have a lot invested in it. And I would say, the keep it simple, stupid method, the KISS method, keep it real simple and just join a league for fun, maybe 8 or 9 roster spots, maybe 8 or 9 teams, and really just enjoy it, because it really can be a way to bring some extra entertainment and fun into your, when the Stars aren't playing. If you're out there and you're a Stars fan, but you still have 5 or 6 guys on your fantasy roster, you might want to tune into that Tuesday night game that is Montreal and Toronto, or whatever it is that you guys got down there in Texas.
Yeah, I don't know how many out-of-market games we're getting that aren't, on national television, TNT, ESPN. But yeah, I that's something I tell people as well, that it gets you invested in the rest of the league. And, to add on to that, I think if you can find a group of friends to do it with that maybe are new as well, that makes it so much more enjoyable, and you can throw in the trash talk element. But if you get that win, that's really all you need. You need that one good season and maybe that one league win, and then you're hooked on fantasy sports forever. And that goes for all fantasy sports, but especially hockey. Yeah, but like you said, you do it for free, and you do it with no strings attached except for just doing it and having fun. That's the best way to do it, especially when you're starting out. So. Yeah, you heard it from Flip. If you're on the fence or hesitant about fantasy hockey, just look into it, find something really simple, get a few friends to hop in with you, and it should be a relatively enjoyable experience, especially if you're wanting to get more well-versed in the NHL outside of the Dallas Stars. But Flip, thank you for hopping on today's episode. I know you gave a little bit of a shout-out earlier, but where can everyone find you and Steele and your show on social media, and where can they find your show as well?
Just like Locked On Stars, you can find us across all platforms you find your favorite content, including YouTube, on Twitter, Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast, and make sure that you also show Dane some love. Hit that subscribe button, hit the follow button, and we all appreciate it. Locked On Fantasy, Locked On Stars, it's a team effort.
Always a team effort here at Locked On, especially on the NHL side of things. A lot of growth for every show, and that includes you guys as well. You don't just cover one team, you cover all 32, which is much easier said than done, but you guys do it well. So if you're listening to Locked On Stars consistently and you want a little bit of a broader scope on the NHL, especially as far as fantasy bets, things of that nature, be sure to go check out Flip and Steele at Locked On NHL. They'll be doing episodes 5 days a week once the season gets rolling, just like the rest of the Locked On NHL shows. Hope you guys enjoyed today's episode with Flip. Huge thank you to him for coming on today's show and talking all things fantasy hockey, Dallas Stars, bets, odds, things of that nature. Be sure to go check him and Steele Roden out if you do not do so already. They've been uploading consistently this offseason and will continue to do so throughout the season as well, updating you on everything you need to know as far as fantasy and bets and all the good stuff pertaining to those topics. But thank you for tuning in to today's episode of Locked On Stars, for making us your first listen of the day. Again, if you do feel so inclined, please do hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Help us get to 1,000 subs by the end of 2022. If you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform and you're not already following us, please do hit that follow button and leave a 5-star rating and or review if you like the show and like what you hear. Helps the show out a ton by helping it continue to grow and reach new audiences. Thank you guys so much again for tuning in today. We will be back with another episode on Friday.